what would be the effects on the economy overall of a rise to $15 an hour for the minimum wage? I read from the CBO, from the Congressional Budget Office, that on the one hand, you'd lose 1.3 million jobs. On the other hand, you'd take a lot of people out of poverty.
I think you would take a lot of people out of poverty. I think on balance, it's probably positive. I worry less about job destruction than I worry that employers will stop paying benefits when they have to pay higher wages. I worry that employers will shift away from the most vulnerable and inexperienced workers towards workers with more experience and more education. And so I think I'd probably prefer to see a more gradual approach and a more differentiated approach to a major minimum wage increase. But if we're going to have a minimum wage, the question is whether to do this or to do nothing. I would, on balance, favor doing this.
So, Glenn, is there a third alternative to address perhaps some of what Larry is concerned about? I've heard it suggested that the problem with the minimum wage is it essentially acts as a tax on the employer. A better way would be to get money into the hands of people who need it through increasing the earned income tax credit, because that's a tax on all of us. It's shared equally. It doesn't penalize you for employing people.
Well, I think that's right. I think President Biden got it right when he said people who work 40 hours a week should not be poor. That's a moral statement. It's an economic statement, but it's not a comment on the minimum wage per se. I would think that the EITC increase, particularly for childless workers who have not received much work support from the EITC, and President Biden has talked about that, and also big government support for training, for community colleges. These are the kinds of things that could help raise the wages of low-wage workers. So a gradual increase in the minimum wage may, on balance, be fine if it's gradual and not all the way so fast. But I think building bridges to the future for workers is a much better idea.
So, Larry, what about it? Would you prefer an EITC increase, or is that just not doable? When you were in the halls of government, did you think about that?
Sure, I would. And the president has talked about increasing the minimum wage, increasing the EITC. He's talked about increasing the child care credit, everything that's pro-training that Glenn talks about, I'm for. I'd go a little further than Glenn. We've left the minimum wage where it is for 11 years since 2009. So I think a bit of a jump increase now, not all the way to $15, would probably be well advised. I think embracing the principle that no head of household or no independent adult who works full time should be below the poverty line. And then the question is, who do we put that burden on? I don't think we'll decide that it should all be put on employers who employ low-wage workers. If we frame the problem that way, I think Glenn and I are pretty much in agreement on that. I think what people tend to forget when they think about the minimum wage is that a lot of the beneficiaries are people working after high school and the like, who don't have quite the same economic need, and who, for whom there may be more risks that it causes the job to have the training elements taken out. If an employer can only afford to spend so much on a worker, it might be that both sides like it better if some of that is training, some of that is health support, and if you move it to a minimum wage, it will all be just wage support. So I'm pretty much in agreement with Glenn, but let's understand that the really fundamental thing we need to do is to declare the principle that people who work full time shouldn't be in poverty.
Yeah.
If we can make that commitment as a country, then we can debate what the right tactics are. And a lot of the debate about the minimum wage, frankly, is that some people want to make that commitment as a country and others don't. And I have much more time for those like Glenn who support that commitment, but just don't want to just have differing views as to how it should be achieved.
So I found agreement on the roundtable, more or less, about the minimum wage. Let's see if I can find some disagreement. Let's talk about the deficit. We heard from Janet Yellen in a different capacity this week, testifying before the Senate Finance Committee as part of her confirmation hearings to be the next Treasury Secretary. And one of the things she said was, we really have to step up. We have to borrow money and invest in the economy. But at the same time, I'm very conscious, and the president's very conscious, of the level of debt. My question basically to you, Glenn, because Larry has sort of answered it, is does the deficit matter? As you know, he wrote a paper with Jason Furman late last year saying, you know what, given where we have structural interest rates, we shouldn't be really worried about the deficit at all, should we?
Well, I think we should, but not at this particular moment. We're fighting a war. It's called the pandemic. And I agree with Treasury Secretary Yellen that we really need to fight it. I may not agree with everything in President Biden's package, but a major effort is going to be important. I do think, though, going forward, if we're going to start new programs, we would need to pay for those programs. I do take Larry's point that as long as debt service burdens are modest, that's important. And if we have low interest rates and low debt service burdens, that may mean we can have a higher debt. But sustainability is a different question from smart. So if we're borrowing money, what are we using it for? If it's to fight a war, if it's for infrastructure, if it's for shoring up important elements of the country, that's one thing. But as a substitute for spending we're not paying for, that makes me more nervous.
Okay, so I may have stumbled across some agreement here too, Larry. Correct me if I'm wrong, because in your paper you talk about balanced budget multipliers. Made me go back to the dictionary and understand what that is. As I understand, that's sort of saying make sure you spend it in a way that's actually going to grow the economy.
I think Glenn and I are pretty much in agreement here on the principles that you have to pay attention to the level of the interest rate, and lower interest rates enable larger deficits. And I think the most important thing we're in agreement on is the basic economic fundamental that borrowing money is neither good nor bad. It depends on what you use the proceeds for. And we ought to be using the proceeds for investments that have high return. And if we borrow in order to generate investments that have return higher than our borrowing costs, that increases and improves our long-run economic position rather than makes it worse. So we've got another sort of bipartisan agreement going on here. And I suspect that Glenn and I share the view that what's going to be really important as we are responding during this pandemic period is that we recognize that we don't have infinite resources, and that the three main uses need to be vaccines and anything else that will get us past the COVID pandemic as rapidly as possible, supporting people who are truly vulnerable and are being hurt, and as the president has said, building back better with major new productive public investments. And probably a much lower priority should be on generalized distribution of purchasing power, which probably corresponds to a problem that we don't really have, that the main limitations have to do with the fact that people can't go out and eat, can't take vacations and the like, not a generalized lack of purchasing power. We need to focus on the specific lacks of purchasing power of the people who are poor.